Okay, welcome to the session teaching about race and developing anti-racist students through literacy instruction. My name is Dr. Dominic Grasso. I'm an instructional specialist with the School District of Palm Beach County, and we are going to go ahead and get started. So for today's presentation agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the rationale or the why behind why it's important to teach about race and develop anti-racist students through literacy instruction. We're going to talk about what does it actually mean to be anti-racist, and specifically, what does that mean when we apply that to literacy? So what does anti-racist mean, and how does that mean when we look through a literacy lens? Then we'll look at some curriculum applications for developing anti-racist literacy teaching. We'll talk about two applications specifically, different reading as well as reading differently. And we're also going to highlight some further professional development, which if you enjoyed this session, which I hope you will, you may consider signing up for over the summer or during preschool. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump right in and get started with our rationale or our why. Why is this work important? Well, when we talk about our rationale, I always like to look back at what our students are saying and what our student data is saying. I think that's so important to really get a good understanding of why this work is important for us to be doing as a district. So the screen you see here is the 2019 Palm Beach County Youth Risk Behavior Survey data. This survey is a national survey that's administered by the Centers for Disease Control, and it's done through large urban districts throughout the nation, Palm Beach, Broward, DC, LA, etc. And why I think this data is important is because it's student self-reported. So this is information that we're getting directly from our students who are directly in our Palm Beach County high schools. So I'm not going to read through this all for you, but you see on the screen we have percentage of high school students who feel close to people at their school, percentage of students who feel they will complete a post-high school program, percentage of students who missed at least one day of school because they felt unsafe, and percentage of students who attempted suicide. And then if you look at the colors, you see the light blue represents our Black students, the maroon represents our Hispanic and Latinx students, and the navy blue represents our white students. So I want you to take a minute and look at the different categories and how the numbers increase or decrease amongst race. And for this presentation, I want you to specifically focus on our Black students. And what are our Black students saying about their school experience? And I want you to keep that information in mind as we look at some more data. And this is data that I think most of us are fairly familiar with. This is academic performance data. This is our ELA average scores on the FSA from grades 3 to 12. So what that means is this is the average score of all of our grade 3 through 12 students broken down by race. And I specifically want to focus on the Black or African American students and look at the disparities amongst the level 1 average score and the level 5. Also look at how that compares to our white students with the level 1 ELA score and the level 5 ELA score. Take some time, let that sink in, make some connections to the data that we showed on the slide before that, which is right here. And I would like for you to go ahead and pause the video now and do some self-reflection. So I'd like you to reflect on what does this data mean to you, as well as what does this data mean to your students. Go ahead, pause the video, do some self-reflection, or if you're watching this video amongst your colleagues, go ahead and share out what you're thinking. All right, so we discussed the data, we saw the data, we see that this is obviously a problem. So now the next part of the rationale is what can we do to improve this data, or what can we do as a district to improve this problem, especially amongst our Black students and how they're feeling at school, as well as how they're performing when it comes to literacy. So the number one recommended best practice to improve student data, both achievement and connectedness, is to provide an inclusive, multicultural curriculum where students see themselves, feel included in the curriculum, and are given the ability to think critically about topics like race, class, gender, and sexuality. And that recommendation comes from NAME, the National Association for Multicultural Education. They just released that statement, I believe, in 2020. So how they develop these statements is they look at student data, like the data we saw in the previous two slides, and they do interview students, student focus groups, interview teacher focus groups, and this is what they feel is the number one best practice. So inclusive curriculum, which is great, and definitely most teachers, I think, want to provide an inclusive curriculum, but then the question becomes how. And when we talk about inclusive curriculum in this presentation, we're going to specifically talk about what anti-racist literacy instruction looks like and how we go ahead and do that, which is our segue into the next slide. As we move forward, we're going to take a look at some things we can do to make our literacy instruction inclusive. And when we say inclusive, we're talking about explicitly anti-racist for our purposes of this presentation. So let's look at what that means. So what is anti-racist first? Anti-racist is expressing the idea that racial groups are equals and none needs developing. So in order for literacy instruction to be anti-racist, we must explicitly and consistently identify, analyze, and critique literature through lens of race, first allowing our students to see and understand racial narratives, and then create space that allows for students to develop critical anti-racist questions, ideas, and beliefs. So that was kind of a big chunky paragraph. Let's break that down. So first, we're identifying literature through the lens of race, and we're going to talk about that when we look at our different reading principle. And we're also analyzing and critiquing literature through the lens of race, and we're going to talk about that when we do our reading differently principle. We also have to teach explicitly about race and the racial narratives, as well as specifically calling out whiteness and the white dominance in literacy spaces. So all of these things are important, and I know this is a big statement, and we're going to unpack this, and we're going to move step by step through this statement as we move forward with the presentation. Before we move forward, I kind of want to take a step back and reflect on us as teachers on what it takes to become anti-racist and apply some of these principles to literacy instruction. So in order for us to become anti-racist through our literacy instruction, we have to progress through a variety of zones: the fear zone, the learning zone, and eventually move towards the growth zone. Go ahead and take a moment to review the statements on this slide and how they relate to the different zones, and start to think about how that relates to your classroom ELA instruction. And we're going to relate these statements together to literacy instruction. Go ahead, pause for a moment and take a look at these different statements and zones that you see on the screen. So let's start with the first statement that you see in the learning zone, and we're going to go ahead and apply these statements to literacy instruction. So I seek out questions that make me feel uncomfortable. So this relates to literacy and curriculum instruction because we're going to give you suggestions of some different texts that you can use in your classroom that might make you and or your students uncomfortable, and that is okay. I know as teachers, we like to be people who are in control of the situation, but when we're talking about and teaching about race, and I feel specifically calling out whiteness and white dominance, sometimes we get uncomfortable because it's something we're not used to doing. It's something we need to be doing more. So I want you to just remember in the back of your head that that's okay to be uncomfortable and to sit with that discomfort. That's part of the learning process and part of the transition into the growth zone. So I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. So that relates to your literacy and curriculum, that you're going to be promoting text, curriculum, and pedagogy or teaching practices that are explicitly anti-racist in nature. So you in turn promote your new learning text, curriculum, and teaching styles to your peers. Statement 3, I sit with my discomfort. We're going to sit with discomfort throughout today's professional development session. And in addition, as I mentioned earlier, when you introduce new texts and teaching strategies learned today, you're going to model for your students how to sit with discomfort and in turn allow your students to sit in their own discomfort. Position 4 and 5, or I'm sorry, 4 and 5 of the green arrows. I think these are really interesting as they relate to our ELA and literacy instruction. Let's start with number 4. I yield positions of power to those otherwise marginalized. So when I think about how this relates to curriculum and application, specifically literacy, what we're going to do is we're going to give you strategies to yield what we typically find in literacy curriculum and classroom libraries to a more broad range of diverse texts. And when we do that, we're going to be giving voice and perspective to students who are typically silenced or marginalized in the curriculum. And when we think about literacy, just being in a book or being a work of quote unquote classic literature, that's in a position of power. And most of those quote unquote classic works of literature are coming from a very white male heteronormative perspective. And what we want to do today is we want to unpack how we can diversify the works of literacy in our classroom. And we'll get to that a little bit later on in the presentation. And finally, the 5th green arrow, I surround myself with others who think and look different from me. So this relates to literacy because after this professional development session today, we're going to give you some book lists, resources, and ways that you can surround yourself and your students with books and nonfiction texts that give students windows into lives, perspectives, characters, and authors who may look and think differently from them. And that's okay. I know it's not something we're used to doing, but that's something that we need to be doing more. So when we follow these principles, we're helping to ensure that our literacy instruction is explicitly anti-racist. That being said, let's go ahead and start to unpack some specific curriculum applications of anti-racist literacy instruction. And there are many more ways to teach and to be anti-racist with literacy than the 2 things we see on the screen. I just want to preface this by saying that, but for time's sake, we're going to dive into these 2 areas of anti-racist literacy curriculum. The first one is different reading. And when we talk about different reading, we're talking about intentionally selecting text that highlight characters, people, stories, and culture from Black, African, and African American perspectives. So keywords there, or keyword I should say, is intentionally. So that means we're not just teaching Black text or Black characters during African American History Month, or being intentional with our text selection throughout the year. So this is something consistent that students see, because in reality, we don't just see or interact with Black people one month out of the year. This needs to be something that's done on a year-long basis, and we need to be very intentional about the text that we're choosing, because when we choose text as teachers, we're giving power to that text in our classroom. And we need to be conscious and intentional about who we keep giving power consistently to. And we'll get into that a little bit further as we continue. And the second curriculum application that we're going to look at is reading differently. So how do we intentionally embed teaching points and lessons on race, including whiteness, when teaching literature and/or informational text? And what that means is that as we're doing our teaching work through literacy and we're teaching our LAFs or our best standards, we need to also be explicitly embedding race and anti-racism lessons and teaching points. And that may seem like, wow, I don't have time to do that. How can I do that? But I'm going to give you some easy strategies that are related to our LAFs and best standards that you can use today. So let's start with different reading or being intentional in our text selection. And let's take a minute and review this infographic or this cartoon here. And there's a lot going on in this infographic and cartoon, but for today's sake, I want to specifically focus on the Black representation that we see in children's books. So go ahead, take everything in that you see here. And when we're talking about diversity in children's books for 2018, what are you noticing specifically about Black representation in children's books? And I'll share out a few of my thoughts. I think that the thought that was most jarring for me was that the Black representation in children's books is less than um, those of animals. And I think there are a lot of subtext to that statement that I just made. And I think that's telling in the literacy world of a lot of publishers and people who are typically in power in the literature world on their perspective of Black people. Because, again, perspective and representation means a lot. And to be represented in children's books only 10% of the time means that only 10% of the time are our Black students seeing themselves in curriculum and in literature. And to be seeing yourself less than I'm seeing dogs, cats, and bears, that's alarming. And that's something that we can do as teachers in our classroom. So we noticed that on that last slide, let me go back for a minute, that 50% of representation amongst children's books was white. That's 1 in every 2. So I think it's fair to say that that is definitely a dominance of white authors and characters amongst children's literature. But let's really take a minute and unpack why that's a problem. And there are 3 points that I want to touch on when we talk about why this is a problem. So dominance of white authors and white main characters in literature is a problem for a variety of reasons. One of the problems with primarily white authors and white characters is the explicit and implicit message that whiteness is a default. In other words, because text selection is so often dominated by white authors and white characters, readers often assume that characters they are reading about are white unless they're explicitly described as otherwise. And that's true. I want you to go back and think about some of the books maybe you read as a child or some of the books you're reading now with your students and really reflect on all that I just said. Readers are so often used to assuming that characters they read about are white, they often resist when their assumption turns out to be inaccurate. This is problematic for a variety of reasons, but specifically because Black and other non-white characters are often racialized, while other white characters remain white-free. What that means is that when it comes to characters who are not white, we overemphasize their race in text, and we don't do that with white because we see whiteness as a default. And we need to unpack that, and we need to start calling out whiteness when we're doing our literacy work. Another problem: single stories of brown and Black people focused on racism. What this means is that when we're presented with Black and brown characters, those characters are depicted within narratives about racism within the story. So I'm just going to call out a great text, Monster, by Walter Dean Myers, typically read in middle school, maybe early high school. So the common themes taught in that text are racism within the criminal justice system and Steve's struggle being Black and dealing with the criminal justice system. So don't get me wrong, those are important themes and topics to discuss. However, when we're diving into the work of Monster, and again, I'm just using that off the top of my head as an example, we're overshadowing the other themes and messages in the story, such as support of Steve's family throughout the trial or Steve's resiliency during his time in jail. So, in other words, when we do encounter Black characters, we limit the analysis and character development to only focus on racism. This can be problematic for Black students because it can lead to fatigue and exhaustion. And they feel like the only times that they're represented, or they can feel like the only times they're represented as a story is when they're dealing with racism. Okay, and the third point, emphasis on historical representation. Oftentimes, books with Black and brown main characters seem to look at racism through a historical lens. And this can perpetuate the myth that racism doesn't exist today. So, for example, I'm just going to call another one off the top of my head. The Watsons Go to Birmingham or Bud Not Buddy. Thinking of quite a few there. A lot of those texts, which are great texts, which we do a lot of reading about those in older elementary years, they're set in the past. And that can kind of lead into this myth that racism was in the past, which it was, but it's still very much alive and well today. And when we don't see texts that encounter racism in the present, students can buy into that myth that this is a thing of the past and it's not something that we need to work to unpack anymore. And finally, I want everyone to take a look at that quote that we see on the right-hand side of the screen. Children need books that are mirrors that allow them to see themselves and their own experiences, windows that they can look through to see other worlds that they can compare to their own, and sliding glass doors to allow them to enter into other worlds. That's a very common quote, but really think about that and how that relates to our anti-racist ELA instruction. So now that we unpack the problems, what can we do as teachers? How can we be intentional in our text selection? Principle 1, prioritize book length works by and about Black and brown people. So it's important that Black and brown people are represented in both characters and authors in full-length text. Although textbooks and publishers are still working on ensuring more diversity, there are rich trade books available for use in the classroom. It's also important to ensure that literacy curriculum includes stories by and about Black and brown people centrally, and not only as text complementing the main works of literature. In other words, book length is important. There should be full-length books and novels that are about Black and brown people and also written by Black and brown people. Just a note, you see an asterisk on the screen, people of color. That is a term that is white people. Sometimes that is used to describe Black and brown people, but sometimes can be considered offensive. So for purposes of this presentation, I'm going to be using Black and brown people to be concise in my language. Principle 2, include a myriad of contemporary and empowering stories about Black and brown people. Empowering is very important. So we need to overcome that single story narrative of racism and to tell empowering stories of Black and brown people. Looking for texts in different genres that feature Black and brown characters, including genres such as fantasy, science fiction. These are genres that Black and brown people are often totally left out or excluded from, and we need to do better as authors need to do better, but we as teachers need to do better with our text selection and making sure that Black and brown students see themselves in these genres. Ensure that texts about race and racism aren't always set in the past. Again, like I said earlier, this perpetuates the myth that racism is still a thing of the past. Finally, principle 3, ensure that curriculum reflects text by and about Black and brown people across the year. So for literary curriculum to have an impact, teachers need to ensure that literature by and about Black and brown people populates the curriculum across the year. So in other words, we want to avoid only reading texts by and about Black people during Black History Month. That's something that we need to do much better on as a school district, and that's something that we can easily fix as classroom teachers. We can make sure that our text selection is something that we're doing consistently throughout the year, not just 1 month of the year. That being said, you may or may not know that we are currently, I guess now, we are now not in the process of, but we are now implementing a new ELA adoption in which we do anticipate the text should be much more diverse from grades K all the way up to grades 12. And you see the timeline for the adoption there. I know for grades K through 5, we are going to be using the benchmark system, which grades K to 2 will get in the FY 21-22 school year. Grades 3 to 5 will get the following year. I have seen the materials and I can speak to the fact that they will be much more racially diverse, but I do want to caution you that textbooks are not and should not be the end-all be-all for your literacy instruction in your classroom. We need to do better with our text selection, and textbooks, while they are getting better, we can still do better. And we need to do better because we saw our student data in the beginning of this presentation that shows how our students are feeling at school. And now we know what we need to do better, so we need to go ahead and take those next steps. All right, so let's get into our next section, which is reading differently. So we talked about text selection earlier, now we're going to focus on some strategies for reading text differently. So when we talk about that, we are going to explore two different strategies very quickly. And I do want to preface this section by saying that we are just kind of quickly going over these two strategies. When I get to the end of this session, I'm going to share some further professional development in which we really take the time to unpack these two strategies and how they relate to our anti-racist curriculum instruction. So the first strategy is exploring whiteness. Rather than focusing on the representations of Black or non-white characters and their struggle with racism, teachers focus on white characters and the role their race played in the story. So typically when we talk about exploring race in literature, we only talk about Black or non-white characters, settings, and events. But I really want you to take a step back and think, why is this? Why do we do this? Too often as teachers, we don't discuss white as a race, and more importantly, we don't centralize the role of race in white characters and how that perpetuates racism and racist ideas throughout the novel or the nonfiction work. Making these white literary racial messages evident helps white students understand how whiteness gets reflected in literature and how whiteness can establish and reinforce racial assumptions of superiority. And I'm going to give you an example of how we can explore whiteness while still focusing on our ELA LAPS or best standards in the next few slides. The second strategy, which is a very in-depth strategy, and again, we're going to touch on this briefly here, but I am going to give you some further professional development offerings to really unpack this strategy, is the race-based analysis. And the race-based analysis is an analysis of the text in the traditional way, which is what we do all the time, characters, setting, etc., the literary elements, except we are going to focus on the central question of how is race represented in this text. And this is a useful tool for helping to deepen students' analysis and comprehension and higher level thinking skills. Before we move on, I do want you to remember our data that we discussed in the beginning of this presentation. So the next slide or slides that we're going to see are not included to be offensive, but intentional, in that we recognize the role of whiteness and the effect that it has on our students in literature. And again, this all relates back to the lack of representation in literature. So let's talk about first how we can explore whiteness. The body biography strategy, which we're going to see on the next slide, is a literary analysis or graphic organizer tool that can help readers explore the role of whiteness. In this common tool, students start with the outline of a body and then position character traits with text evidence strategically on the body silhouette. For example, students might position feelings in the heart or the head, actions in the hands or legs, and traits like intelligence in the head. Students are encouraged to get creative with symbols and color choice as well. So, while the body biography is common, I feel like this is something we do often when we're exploring characters and characterization specifically in literature. What we're going to try today is use these guiding questions with the body biography and let students really explore the role of race and specifically whiteness when analyzing characters. And these guiding questions are, what accomplishments do white characters achieve, especially in relation to our Black or brown characters? What expectations do white characters demonstrate, especially in relation to Black or brown people? And how do white people treat Black or brown people? How are Black and brown people described in relation to white characters? So we're going to go ahead and give an example of this here. And we are going to use Huckleberry Finn. And again, this is not an endorsement or a non-endorsement of Huckleberry Finn. I'm not saying you should or should not use Huckleberry Finn in your classroom. It's just used here because this is a text that most people are familiar with in order to understand this concept. So what you see on the screen here, this is your typical ELA body biography focusing on Huckleberry Finn. In this example here, you see a body biography without focusing on race and whiteness. So I want you to take a minute and read the body biography on the screen. Take a minute, look at the words, the thoughts, the actions, and the feelings that we have as they relate to Huck. Again, this is without focusing on race, whiteness. Go ahead, pause the video here and read this body biography and self-reflect. All right, so what you can see here now is an example of the body biography with a focus on how whiteness might look. So for example, the words that we read on the previous slide, well, how does that look when we focus on whiteness? That looks like white characters don't see black people as humans. Actions. How do Huck's actions look when we focus on whiteness? It looks like white characters are insensitive to what could happen to blacks physically. Thoughts. How are Huck's thoughts when we explicitly call out his whiteness? White characters are more intelligent and clever than blacks. Feelings. How do we look at Huck's feelings when we're centering and focusing whiteness? Well, white characters can put themselves in harm to assist black freedom, and that's that common concept of the white savior. So you'll notice that sometimes these traits get contradictory. This is great to invite students to notice this contradiction because this will help students to develop a higher level of analysis and skills. As always, these scenes are often interpreted differently. That's the great thing about literature, and this is just an example that you can use to get started in your own classroom. But I think it's very important that we do begin to have these deep discussions and explicitly call out whiteness with our students, because just looking at this, I'm already thinking of the rich conversations and the higher level discussions that our students could be having with teachers, looking at the body biography in a different way, calling out whiteness on this slide versus this slide. Because this slide here, when we add in the racial focus, the conversation gets much deeper, the thinking level gets much deeper, and the analysis skills get much deeper. All right, and finally, our race-based analysis. So there are 4 steps to complete a race-based analysis. And again, I'm going to touch on this very quickly, and I'm going to share some further professional development where we really unpack this. But there are 4 steps to completing a race-based literacy analysis. First, we start with the familiar literary elements and maybe perhaps introduce some new ones depending on the grade level and the content standard. So those are our basics. This is character, setting, point of view, theme, etc. Second, we're going to ask students to racialize those literary elements. For each literary element, we'll bring a fresh new question that's going to center the role of race. And the goal at this level is to really identify the racial aspects of the text and whether they are explicit or implicit. Third, we're going to guide students in considering the racial implications of literary analysis. In other words, asking overarching questions such as, so what? Why does this matter? How does this relate to me? Or how does this connect to what's going on in the world today? And that last question, making those connections between what we see on what's happening in the world today, and you can even go as local as what's happening in the state of Florida today, those are big discussions that we need to be having with our students. And finally, students can use these complex concepts to deepen their understanding and sharpen their higher order thinking skills. Make comparisons from this text to other texts, as well as I said earlier, make connections from the text to themselves and current events. And you see the color coding on the screen, the blue, the pink, the green, and the orange. That's going to carry over through the next few slides. I don't have orange included here for the sake of time, but we will focus on the blue, the pink, and the green. So the blue, that's our basic literary elements. And we're going to focus just on character here. So some questions that we typically ask related to character. Who are the central and secondary characters of the text? Then we're going to take that a step further, because our next step is racializing these literary elements. So how can we do that? How are the characters of color portrayed? Are they central or minor characters? Is their racial identity named or left assumed? If it's left assumed, what is the race? How are white characters portrayed, especially in relation to our black or brown characters? How does race intersect with other categories? Then let's go back to step 3. Consider the racial implications. How might we do that? How does characterization in the story reflect race? Does the story rely on a white savior character? To what extent does the text reflect or challenge racial stereotypes? So I did want to give you an example of what this might look like. And I wanted to use the example of To Kill a Mockingbird. Again, not an endorsement or a non-endorsement of the text To Kill a Mockingbird. I chose to use this because I think this is a text that most people are familiar with. So let's take a minute and walk ourselves through the race-based analysis, and we're going to just focus on characterization throughout To Kill a Mockingbird. So first question, who are the central and secondary characters of the text? Atticus, Scout, Jem, Calpurnia, Aunt Alexandra, Dill, Boo Radley, and Tom Robinson. Okay, great. We have our characters down. Now let's move on to step 2 of the analysis, and let's take this a step further. How are these characters portrayed? Specifically, how are the black and brown characters portrayed? The 2 black characters, Tom Robinson and Calpurnia, are much less developed than the white characters in the novel. Although one of the main themes in the novel revolves around racism, and although the main conflict hinges on Tom's character, Tom still remains a secondary character in the novel. Instead, the novel focuses on Atticus Finch, the white attorney who becomes a hero for taking on Tom's case. An example of how level 2 of the race-based analysis might look. Now let's move on to level 3. How does characterization in the story reflect race? How does the story rely on the white, or does the story rely on a white savior character? And to what extent does the text reflect or challenge racial stereotypes? So the black characters in this story are marginalized. Atticus's role as the attorney hero fits right into the white savior narrative. Even though this story is supposed to be about racism, the story is emphasizing the white character's response to racism more than the black characters. The novel allows white readers to distance themselves from racism because they identify with Atticus. And then even looking at the end of at How to Kill a Mockingbird ends, and I don't have that on here, but Tom Robinson dies escaping from jail. So in a way, we pin the fault back on Tom. Oh, he died because he was trying to escape from jail, which we know that he shouldn't have been in jail to begin with because he didn't commit the crime that he's accused of. So these are some ways that we can have these deep literary conversations, embedding anti-racist instruction because we're explicitly calling out race, racism, and whiteness, and still focusing on our literary analysis. So we're doing 2 things at once here. We're hitting our laughs and best standards, and we're diving into anti-racist ELA instruction. I hope you enjoyed that session. Again, I know that was a brief touch on the curriculum applications, and we do have some upcoming PD this summer specifically related to literacy that really will allow you to unpack this a little bit more. So the ELA departments have collaborated to develop some exciting PD opportunities that combine best practices in equity and literacy. The course offerings include approaching sensitive topics, elementary or secondary. In this course, participants will learn an overview of the Palm Beach County School District Equity Policy and State Statute 1003.42. They'll develop strategies for creating and navigating courageous classroom conversations around diversity topics such as race, gender, sexuality, using literacy. Anti-racist literacy instruction, I highly recommend that course. That is a lot of what you've seen here today. It's just a full 3 hours on what we kind of briefly touched on today. On this course, participants will learn specific curriculum applications and approaches for teaching anti-racism through literacy instruction. We got a brief tease of that today, but we'll really unpack that in that PD. And finally, LGBTQ history and curriculum inclusion via literacy. In this course, participants learn a brief history of LGBTQ culture and learn how to include age and developmentally appropriate LGBTQ literature in their classroom, as well as to how to have conversations with students of all ages that are inclusive of our LGBTQ youth. And in all of these PDs, teachers will get a sneak peek of some of the new ELA adoption materials, as well as time to practice and implement the strategies using some titles from the new ELA adoption materials. Each of these courses are now open on e-learning to register. You see the dates there. Please note that participants must complete the Approaching Sensitive Topics course, either elementary or secondary, before enrolling in anti-racist literacy instruction or LGBTQ history and curriculum inclusion. So the Approaching Sensitive Topics course is the prerequisite course. You're welcome to sign up for all 3 in e-learning. If you do that, you will get an email from me just asking for you to send me a screenshot that you've enrolled in sensitive topics, so that way you can take all 3 of the courses over the summer, which I highly encourage you to do that. Again, thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the 27th Annual African American, and Caribbean Studies Institute. I know they've got some great speakers and additional presentations lined up for you. And thank you again. Have a great rest of your day.